Go ahead. Make your
Where?
first noises. Yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the Civil Rights panel at the ADC convention. I want to apologize beforehand for anyone that was in the room on the prior panel on the audio sound. As you could tell from years before, we're taking a little bit different attempt at a setup. Got rid of the typical table and so forth. So bear with us as we move forward in a new direction. Today's panel, so the Civil Rights panel, is entitled A Decade of Challenges. We're going to take a close look at what challenges face the community post 9/11 and what worked and what didn't work and what direction we are heading as we move forward into a new era of civil rights and a new era of really a focus on the relationship between the community and law enforcement and what entails in the future. And for the sake of time, I will not read the bios from the book. Rather, I will introduce each panelist, and they could say 2 to 3 minutes about themselves and the work they do. And then I think we can jump right into questions. First, to my immediate left is Mr. Michael Rolince, and next to him is Ms. Deborah Ramirez and Alejandro Beutel. So, Mr. Rollins, if you'd like to
jump right in.
Jump right in.
Sure. I think without notes, and if I started to think to myself, should I put down some notes and sketch out some thoughts? And then I thought, well, you know, if you've been doing this by virtue of background, I spent 31 years in the FBI before I came out 5 years ago and went to my current firm, Beutel and Hamilton, where I do a lot of consulting back into the government. So, as I said, I have a Booz Allen cards and a FBI cufflinks and a DHS badge on my lapel, so I kind of touch all the bases here, but the fundamental reason I came really hasn't changed over the course of the 10 years that I've been doing community outreach and trying to figure out what is the right mix and the right message between law enforcement and the community. And as I read the title is the community role in a changing world, and I think we'd all agree it is a fascinating, you know, turn on the television any time of day or night now, what's going on, particularly in the Middle East. Can't help but fascinate anyone when you see what's driving that, and it's not necessarily or even close to the counterterrorism world I came out of, in my view, as much as it is human rights issues and people just wanting a different life for a lot of different reasons. That doesn't change the challenges that we have here in this country, and one of the things I like a lot about being in the private sector is I can talk very openly and freely, and it's usually me, and I'd like to think I was that way before, but I'm passionate about the need to get this right for 2 reasons. Even when my last decade in the FBI, when I grew up a little bit and got more mature, I started thinking that the 2 things that I focused on were how do you eliminate duplication of effort? So there are parts of this that DHS should do in conjunction with NCTC, in conjunction with the FBI, in conjunction with others in the community. And at the end of the day, which is why I was such a big fan of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, or any joint task force for that matter, at the end of the day, what does good government look like? Regardless of where you came from, how do you want your tax dollars spent in a way that looks like good government? And we have plenty of examples of what good government doesn't look like. But if you narrow the focus to this, I think there is a way forward. As I tell people now, I use the Park 51 debate as my barometer of just how far we have not yet come. It was probably the most disappointing day in my life in the last 10 years to listen to all what I call the BS from this side and the nonsense from this side, and very little in the middle about solutions to a real challenge and a problem. And it's, so I guess it's kind of depressing, but it keeps me focused on it. And I wrote an email to someone last night talking about the challenge, and I used to talk about how much I disdain the use of the dots analogy, whether it's the president or a second grader saying it, only because it simplifies what is, in my mind, a very, very, very difficult challenge. If you look at something with a bunch of dots on it like we all did in 4th grade, you don't even need to pick up the pencil to see what it looks like. I think we'd all agree this is a little bit harder than that. This is a lot harder than that. But as much as I called this hard, I spent time last week by myself walking the Shankill Road as a Catholic in Protestant West Belfast, by myself. The last time I was there 12 years ago, I was in an armored personnel carrier with a police escort. For them, if you understand or have read about or follow the troubles from '69 forward, and the 3,600 deaths and 300 policemen, let alone the number of Army soldiers, for them to get from there to here, that's hard. So it kind of puts this in perspective. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's an honor to be here. I work at Northeastern University School of Law as a professor, and my research focuses on what are the best practices and promising practices for building collaborative and effective strategies to combat terrorism and hate crimes. And one of the most effective strategies is for the community, that is the Arab Muslim Sikh community, to work collaboratively with law enforcement to develop strategies to thwart terrorism. And a lot of my work has focused on the successes of this model and how community tips from the Muslim and Arab community have thwarted terrorism, and how collaborative strategies have effectively protected the community from hate crimes and hate incidents.
Thank you.
First of all, Abed, and to the ADC, thank you very much for inviting me here. My name is Alejandro Beutel. I am the Government and Policy Analyst at the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be here today, particularly in order to discuss, I think, an important issue with respect to law enforcement engagement and communities in general. And so hopefully we can add a little bit to the discourse. Our organization in the past has done extensive work over about I'd say 20-year period on the issue broadly of national security, beginning with things back in 1993 with our founder Salam al-Mariyati, to the present day with publications such as Building Bridges to Strengthen America, which outlines the sort of partnerships that Debbie has talked about and that Mike has actually engaged in personally. And other things like the post-9/11 terrorism incident database, which actually tries to put some real facts and figures to be injected into a debate that far too often is really just dominated more by talking heads and anecdotes that really don't accurately reflect the situation on the ground. So I'm really looking forward to a very lively and productive conversation.
Thank you. First quick question, Deborah, why is building trust so important? I know you did work on a report that highlighted this and have some interesting findings. So why is it so important?
I think it's important because if the community is going to work collaboratively with law enforcement on issues of hate crime prevention and prevention of terrorism, the first building block is trust. So let me give you an example. Imam Majid, who is the imam for the Adams Mosque in Northern Virginia, saw that there was someone at his mosque who was spending a lot of cash, didn't have a job, and wanted to use the mosque as their address. And so members of the mosque came to him and said, this is the situation, what should we do? If there's not trust, that information will never get to the FBI. And in a good government model, you would want there to be trust so that the imam would know who to call at the FBI, and he does as a result of this collaborative strategy that's being done with Mike Rolince and others in Washington, D.C. He knew who to call. That person knew him, had met with him on many occasions, and the information got to the FBI, and the FBI investigated it appropriately and responded appropriately. That's what you want. So I think that's the building block.
And Mike, from a government perspective, given your time with the FBI internally, how high a priority is developing trust and building trust within the agency?
I've thought about since I left, because I used to say this a lot, and then I'm always checking my facts to make sure it's accurate. I can't think of a single time in 31 years in the FBI that I solved a case on my own. I can't think of a single other agent who could say anything other than that. And if you're old enough, most of you aren't, to remember the FBI story in from Zimbalist Jr., the downside of that was it made it look like the FBI just did everything on its own. And nothing could be further from the truth, which is one of the reasons that I really like the joint task force concept. But my standard routine, and it really didn't vary much at all when I went out and looking for help in any community, whether it was working drugs or violent crime or organized crime or corruption or counterintelligence or counterterrorism, was knock, knock, knock. Hi, my name is Mike Rolince. I'm with the FBI, and I need your help. Every time. Slam the door in my face. I was going to say fine, not so fine, but that was an option. If you've done your homework before you knock on that door, you ought to know roughly what the response is going to be. And in 99.99% of the times the FBI knocks on a door, no one goes to jail. It takes a while to get to the understanding of what a community views from the other side of the door, based on what their personal experiences are, where their family may have emigrated from, what part of the organized crime world of the 5 families in New York they support, whether or not they're moving drugs or bodies or prostitutes or human children across the border. So once you understand that the view on the other side of the door is a little bit different from yours with the badge and the suit and tie on, I think you come to an understanding that you need that support no matter what you're working. This is really not different in the Arab, American, Muslim, Sikh community, in Mike Rolince's view, than it is in a lot of the other communities, with the exception of the role that the media has played, in my view, of painting this community that it did not do during my career with the FBI in other communities. My view is some in the media, not all. I've had extensive dealings with the media, with a lot of people who I really do believe wanted to get it right. But if you turn on the television, and I don't even need to name channels on either side of the spectrum, there's not a lot of healthy, hopeful, optimistic, problem-solving dialogue. I think if you disagree with that, I'd love to have that conversation, because I'd love to listen to the channel you listen to.
Thank you. Alejandro, two questions. If you could touch on a point Mike just brought up about the media and what role this plays within the community and what impact it has on trust. And also, from your findings at your time with MPAC, what came out of your report and your findings?
I think looking at the issue of the media itself, there are cases where there will be good stories that will help to bring and shed light upon various communities. But I think our assessment generally is that it has tended to cast a somewhat negative light upon a lot of the Arab, Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian communities. And this isn't even just a personal assessment, but if we look at organizations, media watchdogs like Media Tenor, they had an interesting study out, and they do this every month. For September 2010, what they found was in the lead up to 9/11 was that there was 40% of the stories that came out on these communities, especially Muslim communities, were actually negative, and there was comparatively few that were positive or even neutral. So the tilt in many ways, looking at this from a systematic perspective, from a larger picture perspective, is that it tends to be a bit negative. Now, why is that the case? There are multiple reasons why, and that's a separate conversation unto itself. But one of the things that I certainly will say is that there needs to be more education on all sides and more engagement on all sides and more conversation. And I think that is something that needs to take place, is a lot more communication, particularly between a lot of these communities, organizations, journalists, and media outlets. Now, and this goes to part of the problem here is that because of this dynamic, it does not actually accurately reflect the realities on the ground. Okay, so for instance, as I mentioned earlier, we have a study called our Post 9/11 Terrorism Incident Database. And what we've done in this study is based on a number of reputable sources, ranging from the Congressional Research Service to the Anti-Defamation League, to a whole host of think tanks and mainstream media analysis and compilation that we've put together. We've been tracking every attempted mass casualty attack threatening the United States since 9/11 by all kinds of ideologies, not just Al-Qaeda, not just focused to Muslims, but across the board. But when focusing specifically on the issue of Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, one of the interesting findings, and this goes to trust, and this goes to even what Mike is saying, is that we found that 2 out of every 5 of these plots by Al-Qaeda that has been threatening our nation since 9/11 has been foiled with the assistance of Arab and Muslim communities. The level of assistance has been so robust in many ways in terms of people willing to, even despite the frayed relationships that take place, is that we have this statistic. And even more so is that since December 2009, nearly 2/3 of all such plots that have been out there, okay, have been foiled due to the assistance of such communities. Okay. Imagine for a moment, I want people to just think about this very briefly, that if there was even more trust within these communities, how much more productivity could actually come out of this. I'm not even making this on a values issue here for a moment, but surely on a policy perspective. But one of the things that I do like to point out as well, though, is that ultimately at the end of the day, when you see the amount of help that communities are willing to put out, it's as I think one analyst had made mention and written in one of his books, that the Constitution itself and the values enshrined within the Constitution are perhaps our greatest shield against terrorism. And so when people try to make this argument that there is a rights versus security dichotomy, I'm a little bit skeptical of it. In my personal view, in my assessment and looking at the data very carefully, is that really there does not need to be any major trade-off between our rights and our security, because really the two go hand in hand.
And I want to stop there, but I got a question for Deborah. Actually, I had that written down. The old adage we've been hearing is that we are trading in our rights for our security. And do you think that that has made our country safer?
I think that's a very important question. And I guess at the heart of what I've learned since 9/11, working with the Arab, Muslim, and Sikh community, working with law enforcement, trying to develop this partnership model, looking at how community tips can thwart terrorism and protect the community from hate crimes. At the end of this period, because it's now 10 years, I would say this. In a season of darkness, after 9/11, we were told that if we traded off their rights, we would be safer. And by their rights, I mean the rights of the Arab, Muslim, and Sikh community. And I think we are losing the battle in the court of public opinion because the facts that Alejandro has detailed are not widely known. And so people believe that they are safer if we deport, if we demonize, if we profile, if we target, if we fingerprint community members. When in fact, I think the truth is in the only struggle that really matters, which is the battle for the hearts and minds of moderates worldwide, the community needs to be by our side. But that message is not being heard. The message about how the community has been working diligently since 9/11 to thwart terrorism and to denounce it is not being heard. The message about how many tips have resulted in terrorist arrest is not being heard. And so how do we as a community get our voices to be heard, which goes to your point, Mike, about the media. Why are all the media stories very prejudiced? They have a lot of stereotypes. They're not fact-based. They tend to be short answers, and the short answers are about a victory mosque near Ground Zero rather than talking about a community center and the history of it. Why is that? And I think the reason is that there is a lot of prejudice, there is a lot of stereotypes out there, and that the dominant discourse is controlled by only a few voices. So what do we do about that? How do we get our voices heard? How do we get our message out? And after 10 years of trying to do that, I have come to the following two conclusions. Number one, until and unless of public opinion, we will lose everywhere else. This is a democracy, and if people are misinformed or uninformed about this community and its role in a post-9/11 world, then we cannot expect that the White House or the Department of Justice or Congress will have the political capacity to embrace us and to work with us. So how do we break through? And I think part of the answer is that we have to create our own messages. We have to figure out how to create our own documentary to record our voices and our stories. And we have to show America the voices of the Arab and Muslim community. We have to tell our stories. And this is not just a theoretical proposition, not some academic throwing out ideas. I am in the process of trying to get this documentary made, and I am here to ask for your help. We need some help with minor funding, and we need the community to be willing to speak on the record as part of a documentary about their truths, their stories, and their experiences. And I think when we do that, we will begin to transform the dialogue in the same way that Al Gore did this with An Inconvenient Truth, and that the dynamic and the transformation of the discussion about educational reform was affected by participant productions Waiting for Superman. And so I would say, in terms of lessons learned, because that's part of what we're dealing with 10 years after, is that we have the responsibility to make our voices heard.
Thank you. Mike, in 2009, 2010, the EEOC reported a significant increase in the number of complaints received from the Arab and Muslim American community. At ADC in 2010, we had probably one of our highest totals for intakes and complaints we've worked on, topping over 700 for the year. You would think 10 years after 9/11 we would begin seeing a decrease in this rhetoric, but actually we are seeing an increase. Is this something directly blamed to the aforementioned media, or is this are other aspects into play? And how could this be countered through a cooperation and dialogue with the FBI or with federal agencies and the community?
Well, I guess as a former math major, I'd say my first response would be you'd have to be awful careful about numbers, because I've said you can give me any number, any set of numbers, I'll make them dance for you on whatever argument you want to make. So without knowing how much time and effort and energy and work went into resolving each and one of those complaints, it'd be a heck of a statement if 95% of them were proved to be founded on a basis of fact and truth and some wrong was done, versus if the overwhelming majority washed out. So it's hard to say what that means. Being an optimist, I'd like to say that it means that more people feel more comfortable than they did in the past, bringing forward their voices, their concerns. There's someone out there who's listening. I asked 3 women in Northern Ireland last week, and I was fascinated by the consistency of the theme that the police don't respond. In Northern Ireland, there's such a gap between, and in Belfast in particular, the people's perception of the police perception of the people, and who's accepted in what community. I almost couldn't get my mind around trying to live in an environment like that. So we talked about, and I asked each one of them, if your purse was stolen today on your way home and you weren't hurt, what would you do? Each of them said they would call, each of them said they absolutely would not expect the police to show up. There's no hope whatsoever that the police would come in response. And then the one woman said, which is a police challenge, and then I would call the people I know, she was about 45, 50 years old, and within 20 minutes I'd have my purse back. And they said to me, what would you do? And that was a fact of life.
Can I have the name and phone number of those people?
That was a fact of life. And they said to me, what would you do, Mike? wallet, not purse. I said I'd call Fairfax Police, and in 15 minutes there'd be a cruiser in my driveway, guaranteed. I have no doubt in my mind. I live there, I work there, I pay taxes there, my kids go to school there. Granted, it's the largest police department in the state and probably one of the most effective and well-trained. But the thought, and I realize there are communities in the United States, I'm not speaking for anyone, but again, I think we have come a long way from where we were. A long, long way from where we were. One of my proudest moments in my life was, you can probably tell what my politics are, but I sat with my daughter in a Starbucks that I've been known to frequent the day after the election, and there were tears in my eyes telling her, even though I did not vote for the current administration, there were tears in my eyes telling her how proud I was of our country and how far we had come, that we would put an African American in the White House, because I was old enough to remember when I was her age, this country was on fire. I remember the race riots like they were yesterday. And it was just burned in my memory. And the fact that we would do what we did on that election night, regardless of your politics, it's almost immaterial, that we're that far along. Are we anywhere near where we need to be? No, we aren't. And I think that community, the black community, the Hispanic community, the Arab American Muslim community, there's a lot of communities out there that aren't happy with where they are. And to dovetail on Debbie's point, and you'd be hard-pressed to know that Debbie and I actually are friends and we get along because we don't agree on almost anything, but other than the need to do this. And I think that this is how do we collectively take this forward? And your brochure says defining our role in a changing world. Okay, we get the changing world. Our role, I think it's talking about you, not me. I think I know what my role is, and I'm trying to move that role forward. And there are people in this audience, and I want to just, it's not polite, I guess, to name names like George Salim and Noir Shore and some others who spend their every waking moment trying to get this right. Oftentimes with the appropriate kudos, oftentimes not. But I would put that back on you. And when I walked into a forum like this, I guess they told me there'd be cameras here today, but about 10 years ago, they said absolutely no cameras, and we're going to do a community outreach program in one of the neighborhoods, and the community's going to come and voice their concerns. We walked in, and I looked, it was about 7 o'clock at night, and the whole room was lit up like a Christmas tree. And ABC was there, and NBC was there, and Al Jazeera was there. And the person who really wanted the camera jumped up first question, and he's ranting and raving at me, and he said, you know, why is there no representation of the FBI in my community? And my response was, that's my question to you. I'm not so sure that's just my problem, and it is, whether it's women in the FBI, I'm taking you back to when I was in, women in the FBI, blacks in the FBI, Arab Americans or Muslims in the FBI. I think the community has an equal responsibility to change that equation. And that came up in the forum in Northern Ireland. Why is the then RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, now called the Police Force of Northern Ireland, staffed at about an 80-20 Protestant to Catholic? At one point it got to 70-30, it was back down low, and the people around the table, who are mostly academics, were looking at the police and saying, so what's up with that? And my police response to me wanted to say, well, what are you doing about it? These are your sons and daughters that you ought to be convincing to take a stand and step up and be part of the solution, not just for your community, for the greater community, for the county, for the state, for the nation. So I've always seen this as a two-way street. And I really think I don't want to sound like the FBI because I've been gone for 5 years, but I guess it's the world that I come from, and I grew up in the home of a police officer and a nurse, so I'm a pretty blue-collar kid. But I've always believed in giving back to your community. If I go to my grave and my children haven't given back to the community, I've done something wrong as a parent. So I would challenge you as a community, those of you who come from whatever community you come from. It doesn't even have to be about this issue. What are you doing about it?
Thank you. Alejandro, one issue oftentimes you and I discuss is the fine line between building trust, recruitment, and actually discussing issues impacting the community. What challenges do you see in that arena? Because there seem to be questions and problems from some community members, if you could expand on that, we are only approached when it's dealing with national security or it's dealing with X, Y, and Z.
Right. Well, I think in a sort of roundabout way, one of the things that everyone I think here can agree upon is that this relationship, and I think actually Mike even just hit it directly just a few moments ago, is that a relationship is a two-way street. It takes two to tango. And being Latin American, I can appreciate that. But, and in that relationship, there needs to be that trust and comfortability. On the community side of the equation, one of the things that I have frequently heard from community members when having been engaged with law enforcement in the past has been that they only talk to us when there's a counterterrorism concern. Okay? And for some, they may see it as, well, there's a very specific, targeted focus that we're trying to look at, and that's one way of looking at it. The other way to look at it, from the perception of many community members, is that you're only talking to us because you're afraid that we're going to blow you up. Okay, and that is the perception. And forgive me for being a little bit blunt about it, but these are words verbatim. I'm not even putting words in people's mouth, but verbatim that have been told to me in the past. Now, I think as relationships have matured over time, there has been a growing understanding in a wide variety of offices within law enforcement, such as the FBI or even U.S. attorneys' offices and state and local PD, that there needs to make sure that there is a comprehensive and holistic approach and engagement with communities. Because, number one, these communities are American communities. Okay? We are part and parcel of this country here. Okay? Like, for instance, speaking for myself, yes, I am a Muslim American, okay, but I am also the son of a Jewish Italian father and a Catholic Hispanic mother. Okay? And yes, there's all three religions in the family. Okay? So, l'chaim. So, in just trying to talk about that for a moment here, regardless of a lot of people's backgrounds, there is a sense of being very, very American here, and that this is our country, this is our home. And so what we're just simply asking as being Americans is that we're treated as any other American community. Now, obviously, there are legitimate concerns about national security, and it's my personal opinion and the opinion of many of us at MPAC that these need to be discussed in a frank and respectful manner. There's no going around it. That needs to be talked about. But national security issues are not the only thing that should be discussed with communities, because, first of all, these communities do share these same concerns on national security, number one. And then number two is that our communities are affected like anyone else. Human trafficking, child sex predators, internet fraud, the financial crisis even. A lot of these things are things that affect our communities, and we would like, a lot of our community members would love to talk to the FBI and to a lot of other law enforcement agencies about these issues. And again, there's the two-way street. And everything that Mike has said up to this point is valid. And what I'm also saying is that a lot of what the community member sentiments are also valid. We have to bear in mind, for instance, that for so many of these community members, they come from countries that, well, to use Mike's term, for instance, they're literally on fire right now. And the reason why they're on fire at the moment is because there has been a long-standing issue where law enforcement agencies really weren't about enforcing the law, but about enforcing the whims of the dictators here. And that engagement with law enforcement communities is not because there's a hatred of law enforcement, but because there is a sort of almost trauma in many cases for a lot of these members, and a certain skepticism that if I talk to these people, what's going to happen to myself or my family? And again, this isn't even my personal sentiments or even the academic studies that have talked about these things, which I'm sure Deborah could talk about at great length. But these are the things that community members have said to me. The average Fatimas and Husseins within a lot of these communities, the average Joes and Janes. That's what they've told me. And so this is something that we need to keep in mind going forward, is that there needs to be this cultural competency, and there needs to be a very, very broader, much more holistic and comprehensive engagement so that even when we need to talk about the things such as national security, there will be that level of trust and comfort that those kinds of conversations can be facilitated much more easily rather than a certain level of tension and awkwardness that may take place in certain circles.
And just to touch on that point, as a grassroots organization, we do frequently send out surveys. And clearly the number one issue impacting our community, our membership base, is the economy and jobs, followed by education and healthcare. So it's definitely the same issues we feel affecting everyone. But Mike, that being said, what is the best way, if you were to give a tip or two to the community, what is the best way to approach, the FBI or any government agency and say, hey, we want to talk about X, Y, and Z?
Sure. Let me just go back to something you said. I think actually I'm looking for the silver lining all the time. But if your survey shows that it's the economy and education and jobs, and my memory's not as good as it used to be, whatever the fourth one was, but it wasn't hate crimes. And again, I want to take that as, would that have been the same response coming up on 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, or 8 years ago? So I'd like, once again, to think that that indicates to me that perhaps, not definitively, but perhaps some progress is being made. We used to be able to say, and I can't say this anymore because of last week's news that they're no longer going to disseminate the yellow pages, but in the first page of every phone book in America is the number of your local FBI office. But dinosaurs like me, although there's probably a phone book in my house somewhere, but that's gone by the wayside. But similarly, if you don't know or don't have a point of contact or a friend or a relative that knows someone in the FBI, well, here's my first thought. Why don't you? If there are or is the potential for violent crime, hate crime, robbery, burglary, extortion, rape, robbery, the whole 9 yards, you ought to at least know who in your law enforcement community. It doesn't have to be the FBI. I mean, granted, the FBI may have primacy over terrorism investigations, but just as you ought to know and your children ought to know, how to dial 411 or where the nearest, fire department is, volunteer or otherwise, I would suggest in this day and age you ought to know how to reach to law enforcement at some level. And I happen to be one of those people, maybe because I grew up in a home of a police officer, that have great faith in the local police. Granted, throughout this country, you have all sorts of different levels of competencies, as you do in FBI field offices, but I would start with a trusted law enforcement officer, sheriff, state trooper, agent. It really would not matter to me, because let's face it, the average person, and I just had this conversation with someone this morning up at Department of Homeland Security, what is activity that is precursor for an act of terrorism? And I said to that person, well, let me take you back. My favorite anecdote that I made up partially was, let me take you back to that parking lot in the post office in Northern Virginia where two of the hijackers purchased phony driver's licenses. Was that act a precursor of an act of terrorism? Well, sure it was. I could take you there today and buy a driver's license, and the question you'd have to ask is, am I buying a driver's license to get a job so I can send back across the border to my family? Or am I buying a driver's license so I can get a plane ticket so I can get behind a cockpit, the stick, and crash this plane into a building? Sometimes, most times, you don't know. And you won't know until after the fact. So, once again, this dots nonsense, no one is better, I would say, anywhere in the world than the FBI of putting something together after it happens. The hard part is figuring out how do you get there before it happens with all of our civil rights and civil liberties in check. That is not an easy thing to do. So my point is, when something happens in your life that you feel necessitates calling someone, the default position on terrorism is the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Let's face it, very few of us, Mike Rollins included, can look at something and say, aha, that's going to lead to an act of terrorism, which is why I think you ought to know how to get in touch with whatever the local law enforcement authority in your community is.
And Alejandro, I know something just came up and you have to leave us a little early, but if you have anything you want to leave us with on this issue.
Sure.
I think he's going to a tango conference.
Yes, that's what I heard.
Well, before I do mosey on out of here, again, first of all, thanks to you and ADC for inviting me out here. I guess the thing that I would want to leave us with, though, is a sense, though, of even though things are tough for a lot of our community members, is that there is, I think, a lot of goodwill and hope that we should be trying to look for and look towards. Because at the end of the day, I know even that people like Mike and Mike, who have been serving in the FBI for many, many decades, have also been trying to serve with distinction and with honor, trying to uphold the values of our nation as well. And I would like to think, and I would like to encourage that there continue to be a movement towards open and frank dialogue and communication and discussion so that more trust can be built, because communities have perceptions and ideas and fears and hopes and dreams. So do law enforcement people too. And people are people regardless of what profession they're in. And so my hope is that there can be more communication to break down the barriers of misinformation and sometimes mistrust that may take place. And hopefully with that over time, I think that there can be an arrival at common solutions to common problems that really a lot of us feel we're all facing, maybe from different angles, but that we're all trying to arrive at the end of the day for a solution.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
for coming. And the second mic, I think Alejandro was referring to, is our friend Mike German from the ACLU, and thank you for all your support as well. Deborah, in all that's being said sounds wonderful, but there are definitely some challenges we face in building this trust and moving forward, and there are models that fail and models that do work. Particularly in your studies and your experiences, what challenges stand in the way of developing these relationships?
Well, I think one of the two best models that exist out there for how this would work, when you say how would someone know who to call, is the model in Dearborn with Ahmad Hamad and ADC, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI office. And there they meet on a regular basis. They've been meeting since 9/11. They know one another. They help to do outreach into the community. Everyone in Dearborn who's part of the Arab or Muslim community there knows how to communicate with the FBI, with local police. They raise issues on a regular basis. They have common ground in terms of trying to thwart terrorism and hate crimes. They're developing collaborative and effective strategies. The same thing is going on with MPAC, the Muslim Public Affairs Council in LA, the largest Muslim community, working with Sheriff Baca and the FBI out in LA, and there are a lot of successes. And again, they're meeting on a regular basis, not just when there's a conflict, not just when there's a terrorism investigation, but in order to address the concerns of the community in an open way and on a regular basis. Okay, then the question is, if that model is working, and it is, in Chicago, in DC, in LA, in Dearborn, in New York to some extent, in Boston to some extent, why is it not a nationally coordinated strategy that's funded and with training? And that is the piece that we're trying to put in place now. There are these ad hoc efforts, but there is no national coordinating center. There is no national training center. There is no national strategy for the dissemination of best practices, promising practices, challenges, and how you overcome them, and what tools, templates, and protocols could we share on a national basis instead of having each ad hoc effort operate independently and reinvent the wheel. So I think the challenge at this point is how to create a national strategy. And I think the biggest impediment is that a national strategy would require the Department of Justice, the White House, and other national law enforcement organizations to openly embrace this community and to say we are going to treat this community as partners, not as suspects. And there is too much Islamophobia, prejudice, stereotypes still there for that to happen. And so I think, one step is to keep the dialogue going, certainly to continue to invest energy in ad hoc efforts, but in terms of the movement forward, we have to develop the political capacity and the political will for Americans to understand the important role that this community has been playing and can play. And if we're going to harness the full strength of this model, it needs to be nationally coordinated, and there needs to be a national training center.
And as a native of Dearborn, Detroit, I have to agree. Anything we do there does work most of the time.
No, but maybe you can talk about Dearborn and what you've seen.
Well, I think the model you're discussing is the Bridges program, which did start, I think, shortly after 9/11 with Ahmad and the U.S. Attorney then. And we have similar programs here on a national level with our interagency meetings. And both DOJ and DHS, and Kareem Shora definitely plays a role now at DHS in bringing together community members to the table, and bringing together government agencies to the table really to talk about issues, to talk about with ICE, to talk with DHS, with whomever, in an open area, in an open forum, which really does seem to work. And oftentimes there's disagreements, and oftentimes there's agreements, but it's a really good program, and I think for something like this to go national would definitely be of a great benefit to the community. But that is one of the better programs and one of the better flowing programs we have seen. But Mike, from the government side, what challenges have you faced? And I mean, we know that maybe shortly after 9/11 there may have been that mistrust, building that relationship, but recently have you heard of challenges that may have been appearing?
It almost comes all the way back from where, I guess what brought Debbie and I together was that actually we started over a disagreement over part of the post 9/11, and then came together around the thought that she just shared with you. My first real exposure to the community came in what's referred to, and many of you have probably been to it, as a candidates night, sponsored, I think still every year, by Jim Zogby's group down at the Arab American Institute in Northern Virginia. For anyone who's running for any kind of office was welcome to come, and there was a panoply of people on a panel, and I was brand new to the Washington field office as the special agent in charge of counterterrorism. Tom Manger was then the chief of police, and Jim Davis was running for office, and there were a number of local school board positions. And you came and you talked, and the first thing that amazed me was how many parents brought their children. And I thought, well, that is just amazing, to try to orient and acclimate people to having a voice in the community. The other thing that astounded me was, and it was I can't remember, it was coming up on a weekend. I said, well, we'll stay all night until everybody had any questions that they wanted answered. There were 2 hours worth of Q&A. Every single question, accusation, anecdote, diatribe was directed at the FBI. Every single one. And I was the FBI for the night. And we stayed. And I walked out of there thinking, something? We dispatch FBI agents to Afghanistan and Pakistan and India and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the West Bank. I don't know anything about the community in my own backyard. This was about 9 years ago, spring of 2002. And it just astounded me how ignorant I was. And that led to the conversations over the course of time with Debbie on how do you do it better than we do it. So we started the Arab American Sikh Advisory, FBI Advisory Committee, and Jim Zogby came, and someone in whom I have the highest respect and the highest regard, and I consider a real pillar, Ziad Asali, who's a personal friend of mine, and a number of others. Trying to think, Muhammad Majid, Hassan Ibrahim from Muslim Public Affairs Council. I know I lived somebody out in the War Shora. Doesn't matter. And we got it so right, in my view, at the Washington field office that we said, why don't we take this to Detroit and to New York and to Chicago and LA and Dallas and Houston and on across. Why don't we do this? So Debbie and I partnered for the next several years putting this concept together. And my whole thought was this: you can't have an SAC, and not that it's about me, because it's not. I came into the FBI at $5,682 a year as a GS2 clerk, so I know where I come from. But you can't have an SAC talking every single issue with every single community member. I wanted to get to the heart of that last question, and my goal was, when every one of you, whenever you had an issue or a challenge or a problem, you knew, if it was an FBI issue, what GS10 street agent you could call to help work through and get that resolved. That was my goal. It might not happen in my lifetime, but it shouldn't be Mary Rose Oker or Ziad Asali or Jim Zogby or Mohammed Majid calling Mike Rollins. It ought to be you calling someone whose salary you pay from your taxes to get your situation resolved. That's where I wanted to drive this. And I think Debbie's Partnering for Prevention concept is the one thing that would get us there. And I still believe that. I still honestly believe that that's the way to go.
A general question along those lines. There is an influx and a wave of a newer immigrant community, newer refugees from the Arab world to the U.S. We have Somali Americans, we have new Iraqi refugees, new Sudanese Americans now. So what challenges are you particularly facing? Because we are hearing quite a bit of the Somali community, and we are at AADC trying to work to address that issue. But if either one of you wants to address what challenges are we facing now with the newer communities?
Want to start?
It used to be, I think, that law enforcement had a pretty good sense and a thumb on the pulse of their communities through community policing, through having the officer on the beat, through being out there working cases. And I think the first thing that jumps out at me, whether it's white-collar crime, pornography, or new wave immigrants, or maybe not new wave, being recruited, radicalized on the internet, I think poses a brand new challenge that nobody's seen before. And the repeated instances where this is happening has gotten the attention of, I think, all of law enforcement. One of the more interesting conversations I had with a member of your community, whose name I'll leave out of this, came when we were talking about what we referred to in the newspapers as the Five Guys case, one of the several cases that began over in Northern Virginia and evolves into a case that the community came forward, and one of the community leaders said to the parents of these kids after it was turned out that they called and said, "We're playing basketball in Laurel." I'm making part of this up, but not most of it. And then the next call they got was, "We're in jail in Pakistan." And the community leader sat with the parents and said to them, "If you want to get those kids back, you better call the FBI." It has a sad ending to it. I think the upside is that the community realized that, and the FBI was there. And one of my best friends said he was going to spend Christmas, which is what now, I guess about 2 years ago, working. These kids were not going to be out of trouble, but to work to get them back here. And all you had to do was follow the Abed saga to realize what the relationships are and aren't between our two countries. And ultimately, the Pakistanis moved, and those kids are not back here. They're doing 10 years in jail in Pakistan. If there's ever a conversation you want to have with one of your children, talk to them about life in a Pakistani jail for 10 years. So I said, this stuff is not hard and it's not easy. But this friend of mine from the community looked at me and he said, "You know this child that was out there and now is a student at Howard University in dental school? It's my son's best friend." So Mike, I'm not sure talking to you and the FBI is the answer. I think we need to be talking to our children. And I thought I was so moved by that he realized that right there in his own backyard, in his family, it's one of those, that could have been my kid. When I look at my friends in college who were arrested, I think often, that could have been me, right? So I'm not sure it's unique to the new wave, but I think the challenge is to know what our children are and it's not necessarily a counterterrorism message, is it? It's to know what our children are doing and be actively involved and engaged in their lives.
Thank you. Anything about the newer communities or no?
I think that all communities have to be at the table, and I think that when law enforcement meets regularly with the community, whether it's an immigrant community or whether it's a non-immigrant community, when they know the community, when they have a context in which to evaluate information, when they've, law enforcement frequently say to me when I'm doing training or when I'm putting forth this model, how are we going to know who to trust? I said, oh, easy. You make mistakes. You trust the wrong people, and then that tells you who the right people are. And I know that from being an assistant U.S. attorney and working in organized crime, working in narcotics, and working in police corruption areas, that you have to, if you're going to develop the information, investigate the case, go to the community, and some people you will be able to trust and some you won't, but you have to begin the process. You can't fly blind. And so I think the more that law enforcement is informed and knowledgeable about their community, the less mistakes will be made and the more effective law enforcement strategies will be.
Thank you. Mike, you mentioned a word that seems to be the pretty much a running theme in the early part of 2011, thanks to Representative King from New York, and that's radicalization. There seems to be a lot in the community that feel that this word is just being used and pigeonholing the Arab and Arab American and Muslim American communities. We've seen the hearings by Representative King. What is, from your experiences, radicalization really, we know, is not an issue that's only targeted and only present in our community. It's an issue across the board, is it not?
It's an issue, and then the question becomes, and whose job is it? And I think community-wide, that question has not yet been answered. And I was having this conversation again with George and Kareem and some others, and then earlier in the day, of the challenge of free speech. And if you looked at the new PREVENT strategy that came out of the UK, and David Cameron's speech of a while ago, the more recent strategy talks about, I'm going to make this up because I can't get the phraseology right, but basically taking on all levels of extremism. And then it begs the question, well, I'm not sure that an extreme view is necessarily in some direction, and from a law enforcement perspective, is against the law, let alone is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if I'm extremely opposed to violent crime, you can call me an extremist. But I think that the challenge becomes, who owns this? Is it that parent I just talked to? If you talk to friends and colleagues in the FBI about countering violent extremism, CVE, they say, that's not our job. Hey, Mike, maybe that's your job in the consultant world, or maybe it's a social scientist or an educator or a psychologist or psychiatrist. We're not the mind police. And I'm sure everybody likes to hear that that's the FBI thinking, that, it's a hard concept to get your mind around, is this whole process of how does someone go from, let's take Hani Hanjour. He's coming and going from Arizona for 10 years, 5 years before the 9/11 plot is hatched. He's got a pilot's license, living, let's say, the good life, a decent life. So how does he go from that? What are the series of conversations that lead from that life to put me in Flight 77 to go into the Pentagon? How do you get there? And so I'm fascinated by the process, but what I think we in the community, and I guess I can consider myself part of the community because I'm trying to figure this thing out and help the government figure it out. But if you have, again, it gets back to Debbie's holistic approach. If you have DHS doing this, all well-intentioned, and the FBI this, and NCTC this, and the DNI this, and there's no one doing this, although that was the conversation with Kareem, that maybe there are people doing the broader umbrella coordinated view of it. Maybe we can get to something that makes sense, but I actually think we're on the front end of trying to solve this whole thing, and I don't know that there are any easy answers. So the one part, I've got to throw this out there because I'm watching all these people sit out there patiently and listen. I've never been on a forum where the audience didn't get to participate. So I don't know if that's structured this way on purpose, but so here's the bottom line. I think there's a way to get a hold of us and in touch with us, either through the program, otherwise if you have questions that we don't get to today. But that's my answer on radicalization. Once again, don't put these dots on a wall because nobody's figured out how to figure this thing out yet.
Thank you. And actually, we were going to open it up to question and answer. Please, let's try to keep our questions brief so we can fit in as much as we could. Jumana?
I was going to say, my ears aren't going to do that.
Or is it just for them?
There you go.
Okay. So my question is this. I think there's a lot of conversation about engagement and sort of what the onus is on our communities in terms of participating with law enforcement, becoming part of law enforcement, reporting crimes. I think the issue I have with these discussions is not that I disagree. I think that law enforcement is bad all the time. We should never engage with law enforcement. But I think there's a conversation that always feels sort of one way. And I say that because there's not this sort of parallel discussion about all the policies that actually have a chilling effect on our communities, that make them not want to participate with law enforcement, that make them look upon law enforcement with suspicion. Anything from the types of informants that are placed in mosques and other community centers, things like the FBI guidelines, which make people feel under constant surveillance and under threat, DHS policies, including the ill-fated 14-country policy, the bulky clothing policy at the airport, the fact that members of our communities feel it very difficult to come in and out of the United States like most regular Americans. They get extra questions, extra detention, lots of extras. And so I think when we have these discussions, it's always curious to me when we talk to government, they talk about how we need more engagement from the community and how the community needs to be more involved in somehow solving crimes and cracking terrorism plots. But where is the government's responsibility to our communities to protect our rights, to ensure that we feel like we can live like the rest of America?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out which part of this is George Salim's responsibility and what's the rest of the government's. And then George got up and left, so there you go. I guess I have a fundamental disagreement with the premise that this is widespread. And the reason I say that is I bet I travel as often as anybody here. And I usually try to be the last one on the airplane for a couple different reasons. One of which is I want to see for myself how many people are being pulled to the side and asked questions. And when the whole pat-down concept came into effect and it blew up, I happened to be, the good news was I went to speak at a conference in Hawaii. The bad news was I flew back the day before Thanksgiving, which I swore I would never do. And in that month, and I approached John Pistol, who, as you may or may not know, was in the FBI before he went over to run TSA, in an American Bar Association luncheon, and I asked, it wasn't a question, I wanted to make a statement. I had traveled internationally 3 times in 9 different cities in this country, and I never saw lines move as effectively and efficiently as they did in that stretch. So all of the hoopla that was out there, I didn't see it. Were there anecdotes? And you do the, again, I'm going to do the math with you. When you kind of give the assessment, and thank you for bringing your child to this forum, although I'm sure that what I'm saying is not registering, but that's wonderful. If you do the math, I mean, what's our vision of a TSA inspector at the jail? It's the nun, it's the 6-year-old in the stroller, it's the unfortunate, I'm looking for the word, groping of an individual in hopes of finding perhaps or dissuading someone to bring in the Abu Muttalib device in the underwear. Not enough conversation in my mind about what is your government doing to find, do you think that was the only device? Was Richard Reed's shoe bomb the only shoe bomb? So maybe it's because I'm a counterterrorism guy, but my focus is on where are my tax dollars going to find that next device? And my understanding, I'm rudimentary on the process going through airports, but you're not going to get that pat down unless something else is triggered. And I think the good news, and this was part of John's display, because you can get to a point that we can move people through commerce. Do we know that attacks using airplanes were successful beyond anyone's wildest imagination, mine included? Yeah. Failures in front of 9/11, failure of imagination, right here. Never would have believed, maybe in a movie. But John talked about the orange disc, which if you've seen it now, is a technology that will highlight what is it on your person, a stick figure, that's causing this alarm or this magnetometer to go off. And it takes a picture and you show the traveler. There's an orange disc right here on your hip. I did this last week. Oh my gosh, I forgot to put my phone in the basket. So the government, you don't hear that story, but I think the government is moving as fast as they can, as economically as they can, to solve some of these problems. Is there a disproportionate number of Arab Americans pulled over at airports? I'm not going to argue that there isn't. And I don't have an easy answer to solve that. And in the times that I've been pulled over and secondary, my son was secondary coming home from vacation, and he's a consultant to DHS. My view to him was, whether you're secondary or someone else is, this plane isn't leaving until everybody's on it. So if you want to hold me up and ask me however many questions you want to, my personal view is that's okay. If that's being done for the safety and security of everybody on this plane, that's okay. Where I have a problem, and I also have staff at the Terrorist Screening Center, so I do know a little bit about this subject. Where I have a problem is when the same person is pulled over time and time and time again, because let's face it, it's the same person. And I listened to Pat Hughes, who was running DHS Intelligence and Analysis before Charlie Allen, before now Karen Wagner, talk about just a couple years ago how he was finally pulled off the list through a process. Here's a retired 3-star who gets pulled over every single time he's running DHS INA. Why? Because there's a Patrick Hughes who's a stone-cold IRA killer out there somewhere. So yes, the system has its problems, but I'd like to tell you from personal experience that the government that I consult with and that I worked in is working to solve those problems. So I understand what you're saying. I'm a little hesitant about the math, as I always am. And when Debbie was saying, which I just, again, have a fundamental disagreement with, and I wish David Cole were here because he's much more entertaining than we are, but when you use these broad sweeping generalities about we wanted to take away all of their civil rights, no, we didn't. From the day the embassies were bombed until September 11th, which is a 3.5-year period, as your government servant, I had 5 weekends off in 3.5 years. 5 weekends, 3.5 years. No overtime, no comp time, no family time, no church time, no community time. So you'll bear with me if I'm personally insulted when people say that people in the FBI weren't doing then and now everything they can do to keep you safe. I'm insulted by that. I'm insulted by the dots analogy. Quite frankly, to those who worry about their civil rights and civil liberties being abused, and I hate that word, when they find 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 anecdotal incidents out of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of cases, your phone records get bundled with your phone records coming from Quest out in Denver, because that's the way Quest does business. You're a legitimate target. You can't believe how interested I am in your phone records. Yours? I don't have the time, I don't have the interest, I don't care. But if they send those records to the FBI bundled like that, is that the FBI's fault? And if the FBI does the right thing and separates them out and sends them back and say thanks but no thanks, this isn't what we're interested in. He might be an interesting guy, probably not. She, on the other hand, I'm real interested in her for all these reasons that fit in accordance with the Attorney General guidelines that need to be met to open the investigation. So if I sound like an advocate for and a defender of the U.S. government, that's exactly what I am.
I just want to take my moderator hat off for 1 second and speak in my role as ADC Legal Director. And the fact of the matter is, in touching on what Jamal says, when we are trying to build the trust in the relationship, there are still issues coming up in the community which are driving a wedge.
Right.
I mean, most recently we've seen a case out of Chicago with community members that many are deeming as a discriminatory prosecution and a witch hunt of activists. Now, we can't control the messaging, we can't control the media, but when you keep seeing example after example, when we see programs such as NSEERS, which has now been significantly rectified, but when you see programs such as NSEERS, the 14-country program, TSA guidelines, it's difficult for the community to think we're okay. There's always going to be that doubt, and your guard will always be up. So, I mean, I would like to think, and our members would like to think, that everything is okay. And we are advocates of the U.S. government, too. And I think, you know, to give up our rights It may sound as a broad sweeping statement, but it is the way a big number of our community members feel, particularly with the examples.
Okay, I get that.
Yeah, and it's not just on
got
a
it.
federal level either. We're seeing it happen on local levels, such as the Irvine 11 case and so forth across the country.
Okay, so let's go back to the math. You've just named 4 cases. If you can name 10 times that many cases, that's 40 cases out of 40,000 cases that go back to 9/11. So mathematically, your argument doesn't add up.
Well,
Let me finish, because I want to go back to what you said about the mosque, and I really want to dive in on this, because for any community, I don't wear my religion on my sleeve. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic. If somebody's a terrorist in the rectory of my church, or a drug dealer, or a violent criminal, or a child pornographer, FBI, state police, city police, come into that church, come into that rectory, use every tool in your investigative toolbox to get that vermin and that poison out of there. And if it's got to be an undercover agent to come in there and do it, fine. That's what I pay taxes for. So for anyone to say, because they are using a legitimate investigative tool that went through a process both inside the organization and across the street at the Department of Justice, whether you agree with the technique or not, is immaterial. I don't say it's immaterial. The point is, it's being done in accordance with rules, regulations, guidelines, and the law. Are there aberrations? Are there mistakes? Absolutely. This is not an organization of people who don't make mistakes. But it is an organization that sets the bar at perfection. So I guess I'm just going to close with, do not ask law enforcement to take a tool out of the toolbox just because people don't like it. I won't go there.
And just one quick follow-up, even though we do have, you put the small number of 40 or whatnot, that still has a significant impact.
Absolutely.
On the trust building we came here.
It should be 0. It should be 0.
Exactly.
Let me throw you out my other number that I like to use. Because I do believe those FBI agents and analysts show up every single day, and they know right now, today, the reason they're working those same hours is because when something goes wrong tomorrow, something blows up, and somebody in your community dies. Nobody's going to point the finger at your community, or the local police, or DHS, or the CIA, or NSA. They're going to point their finger in the face of the FBI. And they know that every day they go to work. Whereas Michael Jordan, greatest player in the history of the game, think about this, missed 52% of the shots he took. And the FBI, not a bad bar for a multimillionaire. So when your bar is perfection, you're going to make mistakes. And when I walk into an office, and I say this in all sincerity when I go in my consulting world, I bring you 31 years worth of mistakes. You can't name a mistake I haven't made. But I'd like to think that I grew from that, and I'd like to think that's the reason I'm so passionate about doing this. But law enforcement in this country, and I think you're all well educated into what law enforcement in a lot of other countries in this world looks like. As was said about democracy, you know, it's the worst form of government in the world except for all the others. From growing up through my time in the FBI and now still consulting, I've got to tell you, I appreciate the fact that it's wrong at times and it's unfortunate, but I would say to you that that's exactly what the media has done, taking an issue that you may disagree with and spinning it and whipping it, and all of a sudden you've got this Park 51 lack of a dialogue. So I apologize on behalf of the FBI and the times when they get it wrong, but they get it right a heck of a lot more than they get it wrong.
Deborah, did you?
I want to be brief because I know this is your chance to ask questions. But some of the research that I've done has been in Great Britain, where they do have a national prevent strategy, and so they are working regularly with the community. And these issues have come up. So once you have a national strategy in place that's coordinated and there's training, then their home office, which is the equivalent of the Department of Justice, every year comes out with a report that says, okay, what are the policies, the big policies or laws that we have in place that are facilitating this national strategy of prevent in Great Britain, which is focused on getting the community to work with law enforcement to thwart terrorism. So they might say, well, there's a law called the Glorification Against Terrorism, and it's come up in every forum. And law enforcement is finding it difficult to talk to the community because the community is worried that if they say something that glorifies terrorism, they're going to be a criminal suspect. So that law then gets put up, as one of the things that's thwarting or interfering with the partnership model. And the hope was that if we created a national model, that each of these forums would not just deal with the grassroots issues, but would also deal, and there'd be some collection of these with issues, laws, protocols, policies in place that are thwarting the process, and that would be part of how you would move forward.
Excellent, thank you. Albert?
Hi, this is Albert Mokaber, ADC member. Thank you all for coming. And Mr. Rolince, I want to reach my hand out and ask you to help us in a different case.
Sure.
Where we are the victims. I don't know if you're familiar with the Alex Ode case, but it's a 26-year-old murder case, a terrorism case, October 11, 1985. This is from the FBI website. There's $1 million reward out there. So maybe Booz Allen and us can work together on this. But Alex was the West Coast director of ADC, and he opened up the door on a horrible morning and was blown to pieces. We have made zero progress 26 years later. So if there's something you could do, maybe Booz Allen can help us work with the FBI. I mean, we've met with all the directors. This money is on the table still, but the case is still outstanding. In that year, according to the FBI reports, more than 50% of the cases of terrorism that year were what they call Jewish terrorist organizations. And this is, to us, perhaps the most important outstanding case, and that toolbox that you referred to hopefully can help us with this. And I'd like to offer my services, and I'm probably most of the people here, to move this thing forward if you could help us with this.
October 11, 1985?
Correct, sir.
Can I have a copy of that before we go?
Give it to you right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You have a question?
Yes. I have a question about the victims. About the victims that, you know, they were rounded up, they put in prison, and then they found out that they really were innocent. If the U.S. government, I'm not talking about the FBI, probably this is not the FBI question, but if the U.S. government said these people were innocent, apologized to them, restored their names, restored their business, it would go a long, long way of the Arab and Muslim community to cooperate with the FBI, with everybody, okay? However, after the 9/11, the thousands of Pakistanis and others that were rounded up, they were sent home because just they missed one time to go and for the immigration to register, had businesses here, had families, had children.
I'm sorry, just for the sake, are you
but-
touching on the NSEER's
Well,
registration?
you know, the rule,
Or the immigration arrest,
the
which-
role, the role
Is this
of
New
the
York?
government, okay, how to discourage the Arab American community to cooperate with them in you know, in telling about things or suspects or something. Maybe I have a suspect about this person, but I'm not sure, okay? Who I should go and tell about this person, which, if he found innocent, still he will be destroyed. Okay? So,
If there's a question, I mean, for the sake of time.
Imran, this is a question. I think it is clear. It is question. Isn't,
Well,
isn't clear? Isn't because if these innocent people that were suspect, later on they found that were innocent. Okay, they were not terrorists. They had nothing to do with terrorism, but the government stamped on them.
And I just want to answer.
If the government apologized to these people and restored their names, it will go a long way. Arab American community to cooperate with
I
the
hear what
government.
you're saying, and you're not going to like my answer, but I'm going to give you an answer anyhow.
And
I
also-
got it.
Let's hear the answer.
I got it.
Also,
I got it.
all these terrorists in Pakistan right now, they are willing to go and sacrifice themselves to blow up Americans and
I got it.
non-Americans.
Let's get the answer
Got it.
first, and then, thank you.
So, once again, if he says, if your question is all these people, how do I answer that? As opposed to, hey, Mike, what about him? I can get to this, but when you say all these people, from Mike Rolince's point of view, I'm going to talk about the 762 individuals, each of whom was arrested for an immigration violation, a specific violation of a specific chapter, sentence, and verb that I testified to. You can go back and find it in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and was asked the question, among a million different questions, weren't they all Muslims? And my answer was, I don't mean to sound flippant, I honestly don't know. It's not a question. What is your religion? It's not a question I ever asked anybody in 31 years. I don't care. When the name Ghani appeared on a slip of paper on Ahmed Rassam's pocket coming across the border in the Millennium, I didn't know if Ghani was an Arab American, an African American, a Jew, a Palestinian, a Catholic, an atheist. It didn't matter to me. But the Boston Globe took me on months later for going after all these Algerian Muslims. The name Ghani took me where it took me. If you were illegal, think about that. What does that word mean? It's not Mike Rolince's fault, no matter how technical the violation of the immigration statute is. And you put yourself in that chair on September 12th. Of the 762 individuals who, in this heat of passion, call it what you want, the immediate aftermath of 9/11, were arrested by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, now ICE, how many of those were found not to have violated, and I'm going to concede your point, you are absolutely 100% right, not one of them was found guilty of any crime attached to or associated with terrorism, not one. You're totally right on that point. How many of those 762 were wrongful arrests? None. Not one.
Well, I think that one of the programs I want to touch on, the NSEERS registration program. And there has been significant steps taken by DHS within the past month or so to delist the countries, which is a welcome step by ADC, eliminating the registration process as a whole. But that is just the beginning. And what you're discussing and what others are discussing, we need to see a rectification. We need to see these individuals you're talking about taken out of removal proceedings. We need to see these individuals that have already been deported, have already been sent back home, somehow given a waiver, their names cleared. It's definitely an issue we are at ADC taking very seriously.
And that issue is totally separate and distinct from the 762. I absolutely hear you. And I think the government has done, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how you want an apology worded, but I don't think there are too many people who are standing up advocating for NSEERS, which was one of those immediate reaction policies implemented by the former Immigration and Naturalization Service 10 years ago. I mean, I might be wrong on my interpretation of today's processes and laws, and I understand that there was a tremendous negative impact in this country from students who were here legally studying, and the fact that our education system is something that people all around the world want to take advantage and should be able to take advantage of, and they went home on school break and they couldn't get back in. I get that. I think a great number of things that harmed individuals and reputations and careers clearly took place. I'm not going to argue that at all. But in terms of when you get into that slice of pie that I was involved in that I'm aware of, I mean, the numbers are what the numbers are. Would those same people be arrested today for those same technical violations? Absolutely not. When John Ashcroft said, if you're one day out of status, you're going to jail, I turned to my immigration colleague and said, has somebody told him how much jail space there is in this country? There's 10 million people out of status. That's not the answer. And if you want to have this debate about immigration in this country, then we should have it. But we can't keep kicking this can down the road. That 10 million number, now people are talking about 12 million, and before my children are my age, the people will be talking about 50 million if we don't do something about it. The Irish and the British, God bless them, decided to stand up and say enough is enough. 3,600 deaths in 30 years, stop it. You're not getting anywhere on either side of that issue. And I think on the immigration issue, that's exactly where we are. If it's too hard, it's just going to get worse. So do something about it. So I take your point, and you are absolutely right on a spectrum of those people. you're absolutely right. On others, I have a little bit different thought.
I just wanted to make 2 points. One is what you're talking about is what law enforcement does when there's an emergency and, as you said, sort of in the heat of passion. And that is to cast the net wide. And a lot of people are going to get hurt from that. What we're talking about is a more strategic and intelligent policing strategy informed by the community, which will, because it is more strategic and intelligent, not cast the net wide and cause the kind of harm that you're talking about.
I'm talking about afterward, when you
Right,
cast
what you
a
do.
wide net.
And afterward, we don't have a reparations process.
Security is of prime interest. Everybody understands it. And we don't want Americans to be hurt or to be terrorized in this country. It is of prime interest. And sometimes you may target some people to prevent terrorist acts. We understand that. But when you do this and you catch some innocent people by mistake, it is the afterward. These people that you got, and they were innocent, treat them right. Apologize to them, restore their names, and publicize it. In this case, you show to the Arab community that you have a passion for them, that the innocent of them were not targeted, were not neglected, were not stamped on. There were so many people that were sent to Syria, to Egypt, to Algeria, to be terrorized over there. In prisons, they were innocent. And the U.S. government didn't care. So that's, you have to, it's both ways. You have to encourage the Arab community to help you. You have also to come when there's somebody innocent. You have to treat them right.
And I want to thank you for your comments.
I understand.
And, we are running a little over, but I just want to close with one final question, and that is, moving forward after, this is the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and moving forward, what do you see in store? What do you see, any milestones or any further achievements we should aim for working together? And what challenges do you feel do lie ahead, particularly this September? So if you take just a couple minutes.
I'm going to let Debbie take this one because I think I've taken enough time, but I know there are other questions. I have to leave to be someplace later, but I'm willing to stay for another hour or so if people have questions and they want to continue this dialogue, because I think it's an important dialogue, so I'll let you take that.
Well, I'm very hopeful. I think the season of fear has abated, what you might call heat of passion. I think we are more rational. I think we are at a transformative moment. And I think it is,
Geez, you're on a roll too, Deb.
I know. I think it is a transformative moment, and that means that for those of you in the audience and for the ADC, it is an opportunity in which, at a time in which we are not confronting national security trauma or emergency, in which we are not reacting at this moment in time proactively. What can we create? And I'm very hopeful and optimistic about the possibility of creating a much more strategic and intelligent response and the infrastructure that we need to engage the community and work with them as partners as opposed to suspects.
Thank you. And in closing, I would like to say, at ADC, there are an array of issues we will continue working on, and the fight for our civil rights and civil justices has not stopped, and it will continue, but it will continue with open dialogue, and we will often butt heads. We will disagree with government agencies. We may disagree with each other, but there are times where this relationship is needed, and more often than not, it is needed.
Okay, so I'm going to throw in one closing comment because I think it highlights exactly what I'm challenging you to do. one of the first people to come to that table 10 years ago at the Washington field office in a neighborhood, Northern Virginia, D.C., where I knew nothing about your community. I'm embarrassed to say how little I knew. And one of those people who came to the table and educated me from the ADC, and then went through this process, and now sits in one of those organizations that's in the crosshairs of everyone else, the TSA, is Nawar Shora. And I'd like to recognize him in this group for what he's done for the last 10 years. So I consider him a personal friend of mine, and when I say to him, Nawar, what have you done? He can look back at me and say, well, you look what I've done. And I guess that's my challenge. Not for everybody. You know, you're not going to get rich in the government, but there's a lot that we can do on both sides of the fence, and I take my hat off to him and others for continuing to fight the good fight. And thank you for coming and listening to this. Thank you for the dialogue, and it'll go on. It'll continue to go on. Thank you very much.
And Nawar, we no longer have to share an office, which we did for about a year, and he didn't like my music taste much, but it definitely, a lot of work has been done in the past 10 years. A lot of players have been involved, but the legacy continues and our fight will continue. So thank you guys again. Thank you to our panelists. We appreciate it. And we look forward to talking soon. Thank you. The next panel's in this room.
They just
The American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee holding its national convention in Washington. One more panel discussion coming up in just a couple of minutes. They will look at Muslims and civil rights and political unrest, in the Arab world in what's been called the Arab Spring. We'll have that live for you once it starts here on C-SPAN 2. Just a couple other program notes to tell you about. Outgoing Defense Secretary Robert Gates delivered remarks today on the